My sister smiled at me from across my father's hospital bed the night he died. It wasn't the smile of grief. It was the smile of someone who had already won. Before we begin, if stories like this one speak to something deep inside you, the kind of truth that doesn't always get told, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the only justice people ever get is the kind that starts with someone finally listening. My name is Nora Ellen Whitfield. I was 43 years old when my life fell apart, and 44 when I put it back together in a way that nobody, not my sister, not her lawyer, not the judge who first dismissed my case, ever saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand where I came from before you can understand what I survived. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio called Millhaven. It wasn't the kind of place that made it onto maps people cared about. It had one grocery store, 2 churches, a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and something close to home, and a hardware store that my father, Gerald Whitfield, had run for 31 years. Gerald wasn't a wealthy man by any standard the outside world would recognize. But in Millhaven, he was respected. He shook hands and meant it. He remembered the names of people's kids. He gave credit when families hit hard times and never once asked to be thanked for it. My mother, Patricia, passed away when I was 11 and my sister Diane was 15. That loss shaped everything between us, or at least, it shaped everything between Diane and my father. Because after Mom died, something shifted in that house. Diane became the caretaker. She made breakfast. She helped Dad with the books at the store on weekends. She positioned herself, even at 15, as irreplaceable. And my father, broken-hearted and exhausted, let her. I was 11. I didn't know how to compete with that. I didn't even understand that there was a competition happening. By the time I was in high school, Diane had already left for college in Columbus. She came back for holidays with bigger hair and louder opinions and a kind of confidence that made the air in the room feel smaller. She'd sit across from Dad at the dinner table and talk about real estate and investment portfolios and the future of small businesses in rural Ohio. My father would nod along, proud in that quiet way he had, and I would sit there eating my peas and wondering if I was invisible. I wasn't resentful, not really. That's important for you to understand. I loved Diane, the way you love someone who was once close to you before the distance became permanent. I loved who she used to be. The girl who let me sleep in her bed during thunderstorms. The girl who braided my hair before school pictures even when she was running late. That version of Diane still lived somewhere in my memory, and for a long time, I kept pulling her out like a photograph, worn at the edges, a little faded, but still something I didn't want to throw away. I stayed in Millhaven after high school. Some people might call that a failure of ambition. I called it a choice. I took classes at the community college. I worked part-time at the hardware store. And eventually I married a man named Paul Garrett, a quiet carpenter with kind eyes and a steady laugh, who built us a house on the east side of town using wood he'd cut himself. We had a daughter, Emma, and then 2 years later, a son named Caleb. My life was not glamorous, but it was mine, and it was full. Diane, meanwhile, had married a man named Richard Holt, a developer from Cleveland who wore cufflinks on weekdays and had opinions about wine. They moved into a large house in a suburb called Pepper Pike and had 2 children who were enrolled in private school before they could read. Diane called our father on Sundays, prompt as clockwork, and she visited on major holidays with perfectly wrapped presents and a smile that somehow always made the room feel like a stage. She was performing, even then. I just couldn't see it yet. The hardware store started struggling around the time I turned 38. It wasn't my father's fault. It was a national chain that opened 40 minutes away. The kind of place with 16 aisles and an app and a loyalty program that gave people points toward future purchases. People started driving the 40 minutes. Dad understood it, in the way that men of his generation understood things they couldn't stop, with dignity and quiet sadness. I started helping him more. Paul and I would go in on weekday evenings and help with inventory. I learned the bookkeeping software. I reorganized the back storage room 3 times until it finally made sense. We kept the store alive through a combination of loyal regulars and a stubborn refusal to quit, and slowly, something shifted. The store became mine in a way it had never been Diane's, not through inheritance, but through presence. Through showing up. My father noticed. He never said it in grand speeches. But he'd look at me sometimes from across the counter, this man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and there was something in his eyes that felt like gratitude. Like relief. Like he knew that whatever happened, he wasn't going to face it alone. And then, in the fall of my 42nd year, he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. The doctor said it wasn't immediately life-threatening, that with medication and lifestyle changes he had years ahead of him. My father nodded at the doctor the same way he'd nodded at the bank manager years earlier, respectfully, without panic, with the quiet composure of someone who had already made his peace with things most people spend their whole lives avoiding. I drove him home from that appointment. He was quiet the whole way. When I pulled into his driveway, he sat there for a moment with his hand on the door handle, and he said, without looking at me, "Nora, I need to get my affairs in order." I told him we had time. He said he knew, but he wanted to do it right. I should have paid more attention to what happened next. What happened next was Diane. She arrived in Millhaven 3 weeks after the diagnosis, which surprised me, because she hadn't visited outside of Christmas in almost 2 years. She came with Richard and their youngest, a boy named Tyler, and she stayed at my father's house instead of the motel they usually used, which surprised me even more. She cooked dinner that first night, my father's favorite, pot roast with potatoes, and she laughed at his old jokes and touched his arm when she refilled his water glass, and the whole thing had the warm, practiced texture of a performance that had been rehearsed many times. I noticed it. But I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that a serious diagnosis had brought my sister back to her father, and that was a good thing, and I should stop looking for shadows in sunlit rooms. I was wrong to tell myself that. Over the following weeks, Diane's visits increased. She started coming every other weekend. She brought groceries. She arranged for someone to clean my father's house every Thursday. She hired a yard service. She called his doctor's office directly, something she had never done, and requested a copy of his care notes, which his doctor provided because she listed herself as a primary family contact on a form she'd apparently filled out at some point without mentioning it to anyone. My father seemed energized by the attention. He'd always been quietly proud of Diane, her success, her house, her confident way of moving through the world. Having her around made him stand a little straighter. I watched this happening and I felt something uneasy living in the back of my chest, like a sound you hear in the walls of a house that you can't quite locate. Then one Sunday evening in March, I stopped by my father's house after dinner and found him at the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize. The man had a briefcase. He was in his mid-50s, with silver-rimmed glasses and a brown suit that looked expensive and formal in a way that felt wrong for my father's small yellow kitchen. My father looked up when I came in. He seemed surprised to see me, not unhappy, just surprised, as if he hadn't expected me on a Sunday. He said, "Nora, this is Martin Beckett. He's an attorney." I said hello to Martin Beckett. Martin Beckett shook my hand and smiled the careful smile of a man who spends his professional life managing delicate situations. There were papers on the table. My father's hands were resting near them. I asked what was going on. My father said they were just going over some documents. I asked if it was about the store. He said it was about a few different things. I didn't ask anything else. I made tea. I sat with them for a few minutes, and then I went home. I keep returning to that night. I keep thinking about how differently things might have gone if I'd asked one more question. If I'd sat down at that table and said, "Dad, what are we signing?" But I didn't. And by the time I found out what those papers said, it was already too late to stop what had been set in motion. The next several months were the kind that pass in a blur, not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening and you don't yet understand the shape of it. My father's health declined slowly and then, in late summer, more quickly. The medication that had been managing his heart started working less efficiently. He spent more time in the recliner in the living room. He stopped going into the store most days. I was there almost every morning. I'd bring breakfast and sit with him before opening the store, and we'd talk the way we always had, about Emma's school play, about Caleb's baseball, about the neighbor's ridiculous fence dispute, about nothing and everything. Those mornings felt precious in a way that made my throat tight when I drove away, because I knew, the way you know things you're not quite ready to say out loud, that we were in borrowed time. Diane was there more, too. She and Richard had apparently made some arrangement with his company that allowed him to work remotely some weeks, which meant Diane could stay in Millhaven for longer stretches. She set up a kind of home office in the spare bedroom. She managed my father's medical appointments with an efficiency I couldn't argue with, even if something about the whole arrangement continued to feel wrong in a way I couldn't name. She and I were polite. We always had been. Diane was the kind of person who maintained politeness the way a general maintains a neutral border, not because she was at peace, but because the hostilities were being managed elsewhere. One evening in September, I found an unfamiliar document on my father's coffee table. It was a single page, a summary sheet, the kind that sits on top of a stack of paperwork. The top line said something about a property trust. I picked it up and read the first paragraph, and my blood went cold. It was a summary of a living trust that had apparently been created the previous spring. The document listed the assets included in the trust, the house, a savings account I hadn't known existed, and the hardware store. And it listed the sole beneficiary and successor trustee, Diane Margaret Holt, née Whitfield. I stood there in my father's living room with the paper in my hand and the television murmuring in the next room. I could hear my father's shallow breathing from the recliner. I could hear Diane in the kitchen, running water, opening a cabinet. I set the paper back exactly where I'd found it, and I went home. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there next to Paul in the dark, staring at the ceiling, turning it over and over. A living trust. The house. The store. The savings account. Diane. Only Diane. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe it was a draft. Maybe my father had simply meant to include us both and the paperwork had an error. I told myself these things the way you tell yourself the noise outside is just the wind. I asked my father about it the next morning. I tried to be calm. I tried to ask in the way you ask when you genuinely hope for a reasonable answer. I sat across from him at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug and I said, "Dad, I saw a document on the table yesterday. About a trust. With Diane listed as the beneficiary." My father looked at me for a long moment. He looked tired, not guilty, just tired, in the way that old men look when they've been carrying something they never meant to drop in front of you. He said, "Diane's been helping manage things. She knows how to handle finances. She'll make sure everything's taken care of properly." I said, "What about me, Dad?" He said, "You'll be fine, Nora. You have Paul. You have the house. You'll be fine." That was it. That was the whole conversation. He picked up the remote and turned the volume up on the television, and I sat there for another few minutes before I stood up and went to open the store. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Because it wasn't just about money. It was about 31 years of morning breakfasts and Saturday inventory and driving him to doctor's appointments and sitting with him through hard nights. It was about being the daughter who stayed, who showed up, who never once asked for anything in return. And in that moment, sitting across from my father while he raised the volume on the TV, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Diane had gotten to him. Not with cruelty. With strategy. With patience. With the slow, careful work of someone who understood that the best way to reshape a person's reality is to be the last voice they hear before they close their eyes at night. I drove to Paul's workshop after I closed the store. He was sanding a cabinet door, and he looked up when I came in. He could tell from my face. I told him everything. He set down the sandpaper and listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about him. When I finished, he said, "Do you want to fight this?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I needed to think. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That night I sat at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed and I wrote down everything I could remember. Dates. Conversations. The attorney's name, Martin Beckett. The timing of Diane's visits relative to when the trust had apparently been created. I wrote until the notepad was full and my hand ached and the kitchen clock read past midnight. Something had happened to my father. Not physically. Something had been done to him. Done to his mind. Done to his trust. Done to the soft and tired place in him that had needed someone to take charge after the diagnosis. And I was going to figure out exactly what it was. My father died on a Tuesday in late November. It happened quietly, the way he had always moved through life, without drama, without fuss. I was there. Paul was there. Diane was there, and Richard. The last thing my father said was my mother's name. Patricia. He said it twice, softly, and then he let go. I held his hand until it went still. And then I looked up, and across the bed, Diane was looking at me with that smile. Not the smile of grief. The smile of someone who had already won. The funeral was held at First Methodist on a cold grey Saturday. Half of Millhaven showed up, which would have meant the world to my father. His old customers came. His friends from the Rotary Club. Families he'd given credit to in hard years. They stood in the pew rows and shuffled past the casket and shook hands with the daughters he'd left behind, and I stood there accepting condolences while my insides were performing a kind of controlled collapse. Diane gave the eulogy. Of course she did. She'd written it herself, and it was beautifully done. Warm and funny and full of specific details that reminded you this was a man who had been real, who had mattered. Part of me hated her for being that good at it. Part of me just stood there listening and tried to remember who she used to be. After the burial, people gathered at my father's house. Diane had arranged everything: the food, the flowers, the neighbors who came to help set out the trays. She moved through the rooms with the quiet authority of a woman who had already, in her mind, taken ownership of every square foot of the space. 2 days after the funeral, Martin Beckett came to the house. This time there was no pretending it was an informal visit. He sat down at the kitchen table with his briefcase and he explained the terms of my father's estate. The living trust was valid. It had been executed 8 months earlier, with my father's full signature and a notary seal. Diane was the sole beneficiary of the house, the savings account, which turned out to contain nearly $140,000, and the hardware store. I was mentioned once in the document. In a single line that specified I was to receive the contents of my father's personal storage unit, some boxes of old tools and Christmas decorations and a rolled-up rug from the hallway. I sat at the table and listened to Martin Beckett read the terms and I kept my face still. I'd practiced that face. I'd known this moment was coming. When he finished, Diane looked at me from across the table and said, "Nora, I want you to know that Dad thought about this very carefully. He wanted the business and the estate managed by someone who had the financial background to handle it responsibly." I said, "Is that what he told you?" She said, "It's what the documents reflect." I said, "Okay." And I stood up and walked out. Here is where I need to be honest with you about something, because this is the part of the story that people sometimes misunderstand. I didn't walk out because I accepted it. I walked out because I had made a decision, somewhere in that sleepless week between my father's death and that meeting, that I was not going to let my grief turn into rage. Rage was Diane's assumption about how I'd respond. She was waiting for it. She'd probably prepared for it. A screaming, emotional Nora was easier to dismiss. A calm, methodical Nora was something else entirely. I drove to Columbus 3 days later. Not to confront anyone. Not to make a scene. I drove to Columbus because I had spent 2 days on the phone calling attorneys, and I had found one, a woman named Sandra Okafor who specialized in estate litigation, who had agreed to meet with me. Sandra Okafor worked out of a clean, modest office on the east side of Columbus. She was in her mid-40s, with natural hair and reading glasses and the kind of focused energy that made you feel immediately like your situation was being taken seriously. She read the summary I'd brought. She asked careful questions. She took notes. And then she said something that changed everything. She said, "Nora, I want you to listen closely. A living trust is hard to contest after death, especially when it's been properly executed. But there are grounds, specific grounds, under which it can be challenged. One of those grounds is undue influence." I said, "What does that mean exactly?" She said, "It means that if someone used their position of trust and access to manipulate a vulnerable person into changing their estate documents in that person's favor, the documents can be challenged as a product of that manipulation rather than the true intent of the deceased." She let that settle. Then she said, "Tell me about the months before your father signed these documents. Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the diagnosis, about Diane's sudden increase in visits, about the home office in the spare bedroom, About Martin Beckett and his brown suit in the small yellow kitchen. About how my father, who had always been thoughtful and deliberate, had made a decision that cut out one of his two daughters entirely, the one who had given her adult life to his well-being, and had done it without ever once sitting down with that daughter to explain why. Sandra listened to all of it. She made notes. At the end, she said, "Here's what I want to know. Was your father cognitively intact when he signed? Or was his judgment compromised by the diagnosis, by the medication, by emotional dependency on Diane?" I said I didn't know. I said he'd seemed like himself, mostly, but I said that toward the end, there were moments, small moments, where he'd repeated himself, forgotten things, seemed confused about timelines. I said I hadn't thought much of it at the time because I'd chalked it up to fatigue and grief for my mother and the ordinary fog of aging. Sandra said, "I want to order his medical records from the months surrounding the trust signing. And I want the name of every person who had regular contact with him during that period." I gave her everything I had. I gave her my notepad with all the dates and names and conversations. I gave her Martin Beckett's name. I gave her the dates of Diane's visits as best I could remember them. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Purpose. But then things got worse before they got better. Because Diane had been busy while I was finding Sandra Okafor. The week after the estate meeting, I received a certified letter at the hardware store. It was from a commercial real estate company out of Cleveland, Richard Holt's company, as it happened, informing me that the property had been evaluated for sale and that my current arrangement as manager was being terminated effective 60 days from the date of the letter. 60 days. I had been running that store for 6 years. I had been the one who kept it alive. And now, with a certified letter and 60 days' notice, I was being pushed out of my father's store by my sister and her husband. I sat in the back room with that letter in my hands, and for the first time since the night my father died, I cried. Not quietly. The ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below grief. From the place where injustice and love get tangled up and you can't tell anymore which one is breaking you. When the crying stopped, I washed my face in the utility sink. I dried it with a paper towel. And then I went back to work. If you've ever been at a moment in your life where something was taken from you that you couldn't get back, something you earned, something you built, if you've ever felt that specific helplessness, I want you to leave a comment below and just say I understand. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is knowing that you are not alone in what you've carried. Sandra Okafor was not a woman who moved slowly. Within 3 weeks of our first meeting, she had obtained my father's medical records for the 14 months prior to his death. She had issued a formal legal notice to Diane and to Martin Beckett. And she had begun building what she called the undue influence framework, which is a legal structure designed to demonstrate, document by document and testimony by testimony, that the person who benefited from an estate change was also the primary agent responsible for that change occurring. What she found in those medical records was, to put it simply, more than I had expected. My father had been prescribed a low-level sedative medication 3 months before the trust was signed. His cardiologist had noted in 2 separate appointments that he was exhibiting signs of what the records called mild cognitive softening, which Sandra explained to me was a clinical phrase for the early stages of diminished judgment. Not dementia. Not incompetence. But a gradual wearing down of the cognitive precision that makes a person fully capable of understanding complex legal decisions and their long-term consequences. His doctor had noted this. His doctor had also noted, in one appointment around the same time, that the patient's older daughter had accompanied him to the visit, had asked several questions about his capacity for decision-making, and had received a careful non-answer from the doctor who, appropriately, had not disclosed clinical details to a family member without consent. Diane had taken my father to that appointment. She had asked the doctor about his cognitive state. Roughly 6 weeks later, the trust had been signed. The sequencing was not proof of manipulation on its own. Sandra was clear about that. But it was a piece of the picture. And there were more pieces. The notary who had witnessed my father's signature on the trust documents was a woman named Carol Fenn, who worked out of a small office 2 towns over. Sandra tracked her down. Carol Fenn confirmed that she had been contacted by Martin Beckett to come to the Whitfield house to notarize the documents, that it had not been the client who came to the notary, but the notary who came to the client. She also confirmed that Diane Holt had been present in the room during the signing. That last detail was significant. A will or trust signing, done properly, should happen without the primary beneficiary in the room. The presence of the beneficiary during signing is one of the classic indicators of undue influence. It was not disqualifying on its own. But it was another piece. There was also the matter of Martin Beckett himself. Sandra ran a search on his professional background. Martin Beckett was a legitimate estate attorney, properly licensed. But he was also a member of the same Columbus Business Association as Richard Holt. They weren't close friends, no evidence of that. But they had served on a planning committee together 2 years prior. Which meant that the attorney my father had used to create a trust that benefited Diane was a man who had a professional connection to Diane's husband. My father hadn't found Martin Beckett through the yellow pages. Someone had introduced them. And we all knew who. Sandra presented all of this to me on a Thursday afternoon in February, 4 months after my father's death. She spread the documents across her conference table and walked me through each piece, methodically, the way she always did. When she finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "Nora, I believe we have a viable case. It's not a guaranteed win. Estate cases rarely are. But what we have is enough to take to a judge." I said, "What are the chances?" She said, "Honestly, without more, maybe 40%. But I'm not done looking." She asked me one more question that day. She asked if my father had ever expressed, in front of any witness, a specific intention to provide for me in his estate, any statement, any conversation, any moment where he'd made clear that he wanted me taken care of. I thought about it. I thought hard. And then I remembered something. Something I had almost forgotten because it had been so casual, so quiet, so typical of the way my father communicated the things that mattered most to him. About 2 years before he died, on a slow Wednesday afternoon at the store, a regular customer named Walter Pruitt had come in for some pipe fittings. Walter was one of my father's oldest friends. They'd gone to high school together, 40-some years earlier. While my father was looking up the right size in the back catalog, Walter and I had talked at the counter. At some point my father had come back out and set the catalog on the counter and said, sort of to both of us, sort of to nobody in particular, "When I'm gone, I want Nora to have this place. She's the one who knows it. She's the one who's kept it going. It belongs with her." Walter had laughed and said something like, "Don't talk like that, Gerald." And my father had waved it off and gone back to looking up the fitting. It had been the kind of moment that doesn't feel significant when it happens. A Tuesday kind of moment. An ordinary man saying an ordinary thing. But Walter Pruitt had been standing right there. Walter Pruitt had heard every word. I called Walter Pruitt that same evening. He answered on the third ring. I explained what was happening, the trust, Diane, the lawsuit. He was quiet for a long moment when I finished. Then he said, "Nora, your daddy said that to me more than once. Not just that one day. He told me plain as anything that store was meant for you." I said, "Walter, would you be willing to say that in court?" He said, "I'll say it anywhere you need me to." I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table and let myself feel, for the first time in months, something that felt like it might actually be hope. But I still didn't know the most important thing. I still didn't know what had really been said to my father in those final months, what Diane had told him, what Martin Beckett had advised him, what had convinced a man who, by his own admission at Walter's side, had wanted his younger daughter to have his store, to sign documents that gave it to someone else entirely. That answer came from a place I never expected. It came from inside Diane's own house. Richard Holt, Diane's husband, had a younger sister named Gwen who worked as an event coordinator in Cleveland. Gwen and I had no relationship to speak of. We'd met at family gatherings, exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. But Sandra, in her thorough way, had reached out to several people connected to Diane during her investigation, including Gwen, asking general questions about the family dynamics over the past few years. Gwen had initially declined to be involved. But 3 weeks after Sandra's initial contact, Gwen called the office herself. She said she had something she needed to share. Gwen told Sandra that she had been at a dinner at Diane and Richard's house the previous January, about 2 months before my father signed the trust. At that dinner, she had overheard a conversation between Diane and Richard in the kitchen. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd gone to refill her glass and the kitchen door was partly open. What she heard Richard say was this: "Your father is going to start getting confused. That's what happens with the medication and the heart situation. You need to do this now, before he gets to the point where anyone can question it." And what she heard Diane say in response was, "Martin says as long as we do it right, everything's clean. But I need more time with him first. I need him to feel like it was his idea." Gwen had told herself it was a private family financial matter and that it wasn't her business. She had lived with that for over a year. But when Sandra reached out, something had finally broken loose in her. She was willing to testify. In writing, if necessary. Under oath. The case had just become something entirely different. The hearing was held on a rainy morning in April, in a probate courtroom in the county seat, 26 miles from Millhaven. It wasn't a jury trial. Estate cases in Ohio are heard by a judge. The judge was a woman named Honorable Ruth Clemens, who had sharp eyes and no tolerance for what she called procedural theater. Sandra had warned me about her. She said Judge Clemens was fair but demanding, and that she would push back hard on any evidence she found weak. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a gray blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, with Sandra beside me and Paul in the row behind. Emma and Caleb were at school. I had not wanted them there. Diane sat at the respondent's table with a different attorney, someone from a large Cleveland firm, a man named Douglas Farr who had the expensive haircut and carefully practiced composure of someone accustomed to winning. He was good. I could tell that from the moment he arranged his papers on the table. But I also noticed, when Diane sat down and glanced over at me, that her hands were clasped very tightly in her lap. The first hour was procedural. Both attorneys presented their basic positions. Douglas Farr argued that the living trust was a properly executed legal document reflecting Gerald Whitfield's clearly expressed wishes, and that my claim of undue influence was based on circumstantial evidence and the understandable but legally irrelevant grief of a disappointed heir. Sandra argued that the evidence demonstrated a deliberate, coordinated effort to exploit a vulnerable man's trust in his older daughter, that the timing and circumstances of the trust signing raised serious questions about Gerald Whitfield's capacity for independent decision-making, and that witness testimony would demonstrate that the document did not reflect his true wishes. Judge Clemens listened to both arguments without expression. Then she said, "Let's see the evidence." Sandra went first. She walked the judge through the medical records, the cognitive softening notation, the medication, the timeline. She presented the notary's account of the signing. She presented the professional connection between Martin Beckett and Richard Holt. She presented it all in the calm, methodical way she did everything, building it piece by piece like a wall that held its shape the more you looked at it. Douglas Farr pushed back on each piece. He had responses prepared for all of it. The cognitive notation was not a finding of incapacity. The notary coming to the house was a common practice for elderly clients. The professional association between Beckett and Holt was distant and had no documented effect on the legal advice provided. He wasn't wrong, exactly. Each individual piece was answerable. That was the thing about undue influence cases. The whole was always more than the sum of its parts, but the individual parts could always be explained away. Sandra knew this. She had told me about it. She had also told me that the case didn't hinge on any single piece of evidence. It hinged on Gwen. Gwen Holt took the stand in the second hour of the hearing. She was clearly nervous. Her hands were folded in her lap the same way Diane's were, which struck me with a kind of sad symmetry. She answered Sandra's questions carefully, in a low voice that the court reporter had to ask her twice to raise. She described the dinner. She described going to the kitchen for a refill. She described what she had heard. When she recited Richard's words, "You need to do this now, before he gets to the point where anyone can question it," I heard Diane make a sound. Not loud. The softest of sounds. The sound of someone who had been certain of something and had just, in an instant, become uncertain. Douglas Farr's cross-examination of Gwen was aggressive. He challenged her memory. He questioned her motives. He pointed out that she had waited over a year to come forward and suggested that her testimony was timed for strategic effect rather than emerging from genuine conscience. Gwen looked at him steadily and said, "I waited because I didn't want to believe it. And then I couldn't keep not believing it anymore." There was a pause in the courtroom after she said that. The kind of pause that happens when something true has been said and everyone in the room feels it landing. Walter Pruitt testified after Gwen. He was 81 years old and he walked slowly and he wore a bolo tie that I recognized from 20 years of Saturday mornings at the store. He sat in the witness chair and he told Judge Clemens, in his plain and unhurried voice, that Gerald Whitfield had told him more than once that he wanted Nora to have the hardware store. That it was Nora who had kept it alive. That it was Nora who deserved it. Douglas Farr attempted to argue that verbal statements of intent were superseded by the legal document. Sandra countered that verbal statements of intent, when corroborated by multiple witnesses and contradicted by a document signed under suspicious circumstances, were directly relevant to establishing the true wishes of the testator. Judge Clemens took a 1-hour recess. I sat in a small room down the hall from the courtroom with Sandra and Paul. Nobody said very much. Paul held my hand. Sandra reviewed her notes. The rain outside had softened to a thin drizzle that made the windows look blurred. I thought about my father. I thought about him the way I always did, not in any grand or composed way, but in small pieces. The way he smelled like sawdust and coffee. The way he held a door open for everyone, automatically, without thinking about it. The way he had said my mother's name at the very end, as if she were the only fixed point in a room that had started to tilt. I wondered what he had really understood in those last months. I wondered if some part of him, buried under the fatigue and the medication and Diane's constant careful presence, had still known what he truly wanted. I wondered if he had tried to hold on to it and simply hadn't had the strength. Judge Clemens came back at precisely 1:45 in the afternoon. She spoke for 9 minutes. I counted later, in the transcript. She stopped in the aisle and turned and she said, quietly, so only I could hear it, "Dad wanted someone who could handle it." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about 31 years. I thought about thunderstorms and braided hair. I thought about pot roast and bolo ties and 81-year-old men in bolo ties telling the truth. I said, "He wanted me." And I walked past her and out of the courtroom into the thin April rain. The appeal was filed and, 6 months later, dismissed. The estate was settled the following spring. I received half of everything, the house, the savings account, my half of the store's value. Diane received the same. Richard's development company made one more attempt to purchase the store outright, and I declined in a letter written by Sandra that was 2 sentences long. I still run the hardware store today. Some of the same customers who came to my father's funeral come in on Saturday mornings. I keep his reading glasses in the top drawer of the old counter, where he always left them. I don't know exactly why. I just do. Paul built new shelves in the back room last fall. They are perfect. Of course they are. Emma works the register on weekends now. She's got my father's way of remembering names, and it shows. People leave smiling without knowing exactly why. Caleb asks sometimes why Aunt Diane never comes around anymore. I tell him that people handle loss in different ways, and that the important thing is to show up for the people who need you. He seems to accept that. He's 12. He's got time to understand the rest. I think about justice a lot, more than I used to. Real justice isn't loud. It doesn't always look like a courtroom moment or a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it looks like an 81-year-old man in a bolo tie sitting in a chair and telling a simple truth. Sometimes it looks like a woman who had a long time to decide what was right finally deciding it. Sometimes it looks like a judge in a wet-windowed courtroom who listens carefully and calls a thing what it is. My father used to say that a good store is built on trust. That if people know they can count on you, they'll come back. It took me 4 to 4 years to understand that he wasn't just talking about hardware. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Leave a comment and let us know. Because it is something genuinely remarkable to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if this one meant something to you, if it reminded you of something you've carried or someone you fought for, hit that like button and subscribe. Because there are more stories here that were made for exactly the people who needed to find them.